The Soviets knew it yet, but they had just taken the first steps in what eventually became the space race. Now, von Braun was perfectly aware that the Third Reich's days were numbered, and if he wished to continue pursuing his dream of space travel, it would have to be elsewhere, especially since he knew that the Nazi officers who were protecting him and his team were under orders to shoot him if it looked like he was going to fall in enemy hands. So obviously, he had to escape and weighed his options on who to surrender to. The Soviets were the less desirable choice, since it was well known how they treated their prisoners. The only real option was to surrender to the Americans, and after his escape, that's exactly what he did. In exchange for his full cooperation and knowledge of the V-2 rocket program, von Braun would be given full immunity and was whisked away to the United States. With von Braun out of their reach, the Soviets now had to play catch-up by scavenging abandoned V-2 rocket factories and finding other German rocket engineers who had been left behind in East Germany. They would also recruit one man to take von Braun's position as chief designer in their rocket program, and that man was Sergei Korolev. Now, he had been falsely imprisoned during the Great Purge under acts of sabotage in the Soviets' Rocket Research Institute and was sentenced to 10 years in one of Stalin's gulags. In 1945, he was released after serving 6 years of his 10-year sentence by recommendation from one of the very men who had denounced him in the first place, his old colleague, Valentin Glushko. Now, I'm sure Glushko felt incredibly awkward about the whole situation, but he was smart enough to know that Sergei Korolev was the man for the job. Not only was he an innovator, a genius, but for all intents and purposes, he would become von Braun's rival and ultimately his equal, especially since they both shared the same dream of space travel. On August 6, 1945, the world was stunned when America dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This only served to strengthen Soviet resolve because not only did the Americans possess the A-bomb now, but von Braun and his rockets. Just a month before this, however, a Soviet spy called Klaus Fuchs, who had been working on the Manhattan Project, stole classified blueprints of the atom bomb and sent them to Moscow on the 2nd of July, 1945. Once the Soviets witnessed the atomic bomb's true destructive power in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin immediately ordered that their own bombs be built, as well as continue developing their rocket technology. The Soviets were under the natural assumption that the next logical step for America would be to build missiles fitted with their atomic weapons. But surprisingly, that wasn't the case. Von Braun and his team weren't continuing their research. The Americans were quite happy to let their department collect dust, preferring to instead entrust future delivery of the bombs be made by planes, just like they had done in Japan. That was until they got their wake-up call. On the 29th of August 1949, the first Soviet atomic bomb was detonated on a test site in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. This time, the West was horrified, especially with how quickly the Soviet Union was able to do it. And just a month later, on the 25th of September 1949, the Soviets had successfully launched an improved version of the V-2 rocket, which they dubbed the R-2. It had twice the range of the V-2 and was capable of hitting England. 1949 was significant because it marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race between America and the Soviet Union, each side working furiously to develop nuclear weapons capable of destroying each other. And much of the time they spent doing so was very neck and neck. On November 1st, 1952, the Americans tested the world's first hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean. On the 12th of August 1953, the Russians developed an H-bomb of their own and tested it in Kazakhstan. Now, some of you may be asking, what does all this have to do with space travel? Well, the development of the rocket technology necessary for space travel could only have been achieved with military funding. So when Sergei Korolev was asked if he could build a new rocket that could transport a thermonuclear warhead to America, he said yes he could, because he knew that same rocket could also reach space and also transport and launch a satellite in Earth's orbit. The funding he got from the Soviet Union was exactly what he needed to make that happen. In America, however, von Braun was having a much harder time selling the idea to the US Army and was hardly getting any funding at all for his rockets. So what he decides to do instead, and I find this very funny by the way, is to go over the Army's head and instead sell the idea of space flight and traveling to the moon directly to the American people. How does he do this? Well, through Walt Disney, of course.
Here to reveal a plan for a trip around the moon is the chief of the guided missile development at the United States Army's Redstone Arsenal, Dr. Werner von Braun.
A voyage around the moon must be made in 2 phases. A rocket ship taking off from the Earth's surface will use almost all the fuel it can carry just to attain a speed great enough to balance the pull of gravity. Unpowered, it will then keep circling the Earth in an orbit outside of the atmosphere. This is the first phase. However, if we can refuel the ship in this orbit with fuel brought up by cargo rocket ships, it can set out on the second phase, the trip around the moon and back.
This televised primetime event made Dr. Werner von Braun a household name as 40 million Americans were glued to their screens. Von Braun's plan absolutely worked as things began to get moving in Washington that would later help him get the funding he needed for his rockets.
The President today approved plans by this country of going forward for the launching of a small, unmanned, Earth-circling satellite in the region beyond the Earth's atmosphere.
What did we learn today, guys? When someone tells you not to follow your dreams, don't just accept it. It might very well happen if you keep at it. So anyway, back in the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev was also watching how things were developing in America. Anxious to get his own satellite into orbit first, he worked furiously on his R-7 rocket. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, told Korolev that if the R-7 worked, then he would be allowed to fit the next launch with a satellite. After several failures, the R-7 was finally able to launch successfully on August 21st, 1957, and traveled 3,700 miles, going further than any rocket before and capable of hitting America. Sergei Korolev could now proceed with his satellite, which they called Sputnik. Now, the satellite itself was very simple in design. It was just a relatively small ball, about 22.5 inches in diameter, with 4 long radio antennae. It was stripped down to only the bare essentials in order to make it light enough to be carried by the R-7. All it needed to do was to transmit a radio signal, proving to the world of its success. On the 4th of October, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite into orbit. And the world took notice.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A 3-stage rocket. Number 1, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
This was it. This was the moment that officially started the space race. It was the kick up the proverbial backside America needed to get them in the game. Its public was awash with different emotions. Some of them were excited with this scientific breakthrough, while others were even frightened.
But the American people are alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this. We fear this.
But more than fear, more than excitement, the biggest thing Sputnik did was sting America's pride. And they couldn't let that slide. However, whilst America was rushing in with their own satellite, the Russians were already thinking one step ahead. On November 3rd, 1957, Sputnik 2 was launched. But this was no mere satellite. On board it carried a dog called Laika, the first living creature in space. The purpose of the experiment was to see if an animal, or eventually a human, could survive the stress of leaving Earth's atmosphere. It was a complete success, although, rather sadly, Laika only survived for 5 hours in Earth's orbit before succumbing to heat exhaustion. Many people were outraged that the Soviets didn't even attempt to come up with a way to bring her back down beforehand. Regardless, it was clear to everyone that the Cold War would not only take place on Earth, but in outer space. And for years, Werner von Braun had been fighting to make his voice heard in the military. But bureaucracy and politics had always stood in his way. Now that the Russians were in space, they were starting to pay attention. He would get his chance to go ahead with launching his satellite, but he had to wait, for some stupid reason, for the Navy to have first dibs. The Vanguard TV-3 was America's first attempt to launch a satellite on December 6, 1957. And as you can see here, it failed spectacularly because the Navy was sloppy and they rushed it. The Americans, hoping to have a little bit of their pride restored, instead became a laughingstock to the Soviet Union. Premier Khrushchev hit them with a sick burn, saying, "The United States sleeps under a Soviet moon." So since the Navy cocked up their chance, Werner von Braun finally got the go-ahead. On the 31st of January 1958, Explorer 1 was launched without incident. Unlike Sputnik, this American satellite would collect scientific data from space. The success of Explorer 1 cannot be understated, as it allowed von Braun to have all the funding he would need. On July 29, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration would be formed. NASA would take the charge in winning the space race for America. And less than a year later, they announced Project Mercury at a press conference, introducing a plan to put the first American into space. Meanwhile, the Soviets were still making headline news by sending probes to the moon as part of their lunar program. On October 7th, 1959, one of these probes, called Luna 3, sent back photographs, and for the first time in history, humans can now see what the dark side of the moon looks like. But this was still more of a sideshow, as the Soviets were also planning to put a man into space. After an intensive training program, the man who would be chosen for this was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. On the 12th of April 1961, the Vostok 1 rocket was launched, carrying Yuri 17,500 miles an hour. Each step of the way, another booster rocket would drop off as he went higher and higher and higher, the G-force pressing up against his body until the final rocket stage shut down and Vostok 1 reached orbit. And like flicking a switch, the G-force was gone and was replaced with weightlessness. And then Yuri looked out the window of his capsule and became the first human being to ever see the Earth from space. After just over an hour in orbit, the Vostok re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and as the first man to orbit the Earth, Yuri Gagarin received a hero's welcome, winning many medals and titles, including being awarded by Premier Khrushchev Hero of the Soviet Union, which was the highest honor of the nation. He also became an international celebrity as he traveled all over the globe doing interviews about his historic adventure, promoting the Soviet Union's superiority in space. To the Americans, however, it was another crushing blow to their national pride, and despite their own great accomplishment of putting Alan Shepard, the first American, into space less than a month later, it still wasn't enough. NASA always seemed to be just one step behind the Soviets, and John F. Kennedy, the American president, decided that being in second place just wasn't going to cut it anymore. Instead of trying to catch up to the Soviets, he would shift NASA's attention to focus on the end goal. In one of the greatest speeches of all time, he publicly announced that America would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Good God, I love that man. Now that was a president. Whatever his real political motivations may have been supporting all of this, it can't be denied that his passion and perseverance to get the American people and Congress behind NASA changed everything. They got better funding, better resources, and the Apollo program was started shortly afterwards with the goal to put Americans on the moon. This was the tipping point where things would begin to turn in America's favor. It's just such a shame he didn't live to see it. Unfortunately for Sergei Korolev, he would get nowhere near the same kind of support from his government for his planned mission to the moon. He was mostly expected to just work with what he had, and most of the technology wasn't as advanced as what the Americans had. Even after completing yet another historic achievement by having Alexei Leonov be the first man to spacewalk outside his capsule on the 18th of March, 1965. The real reason why is because the Soviet Union just saw the space race as yet another propaganda tool, and they weren't terribly interested in its scientific advancements. The funding he was given instead was just a fraction of what he really needed. Over the coming months, NASA was sending more and more manned missions into space, performing spacewalks of their own and doing docking procedures. All of the necessary steps to prepare for their trip to the moon. At last, the Americans were beginning to overtake the Soviets, but the worst blow to the Soviet space program came on the 14th of January, 1966, when tragically, Sergei Korolev died. This was brought about from a kidney disorder he had picked up during his time in the Gulag, and his health had been deteriorating due to the stress of his space missions. The doctors had previously warned him about this when he had his first heart attack in 1960 to back down from his work. Otherwise, they couldn't guarantee that he would live for much longer. But Sergei persevered despite this risk, fearing that Khrushchev would cancel the Soviet space program altogether. Such was his commitment to space exploration. Sad to say, but Korolev's death worked in NASA's favor. Von Braun's only true rival was now out of the picture, and they no longer had to truly concern themselves with the Soviets catching up. And then, on December 21st, 1968, just over 100 years after Jules Verne published his book, From the Earth to the Moon, NASA launched Apollo 8. On board were 3 astronauts, William Anders, Frank Borman, and Jim Lovell. This time, they were leaving Earth and flying straight to the moon, traveling 234,000 miles, going further than any human being had ever gone before. Their 6-day mission would be to orbit the moon and return safely. Entering its orbit, they became the first human beings to ever look down on the lunar surface with the naked eye. But even more incredible was that as they made their way around its dark side, William Anders grabbed a camera and recorded a truly spectacular sight, the Earth rising over the moon's horizon. 2 more missions would follow, and still the Soviets were nowhere close to catching up with a manned mission of their own. And then, a year later, the day finally came. On July 16, 1969, the world held its breath as Apollo 11 was launched, carrying Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon. This was the mission that would achieve Wernher von Braun's lifelong dream and fulfill a promise made by NASA and John F. Kennedy to land men on the moon before the end of the decade. 4 days later, Apollo 11 entered the moon's orbit. As Michael Collins stayed behind in the command module, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended down to the surface on the lunar module. Back on Earth, 500 million people were watching every step of the way, marking it as one of the biggest televised events in history. Neil Armstrong opened the hatch and began making his way down the ladder. Then he said those immortal words.
I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
True to his words, John F. Kennedy's proposal to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade had finally been achieved. However, NASA wasn't quite done yet and would continue with further missions. After Apollo 11 came Apollo 12, another successful moon landing that took place on November 24th, 1969. Now, originally NASA had a budget for 10 moon landings, but despite how successful Apollo 11 was, there were politicians pressuring them to cut costs.
People in my state have been asking why we're continuing to fund this program now that we've beaten the Russians to the moon.
As a result of people like this, by the time Apollo 13 was scheduled to launch on April 11th, 1970, the 10 moon landings were to be cut down to 9, and its aftermath would cut down even more. And this is obviously where the movie begins. The crew selected for Apollo 13 was Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, played by Bill Paxton, Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot, played by Gary Sinise, and finally Jim Lovell, the commander, played by Tom Hanks. Now, a cool thing to note about Jim Lovell is that by this point, he was the world's most traveled astronaut, with 572 hours of spaceflight, with 3 missions under his belt, including Apollo 8, the first manned mission to orbit the moon. Now he would get the opportunity to land on it. However, just a few days before the mission launch, the first bit of bad luck came when Ken Mattingly was exposed to German measles. As a precaution, NASA replaced him with the backup command module pilot, Jack Swigert, played by Kevin Bacon. Now, some people use this last-minute replacement as yet another example of the superstitious bad luck looming over the mission. All just because it was the 13th Apollo mission, and 13 is seen as an unlucky number. I'm glad to see that the movie accurately points out that the folks over at NASA aren't exactly a superstitious bunch.
I'm gonna walk on the moon, Marilyn.
No. Literally, it's 13. Why 13?
It comes after 12, huh?
By the way, I'm happy to say that Marilyn's initial nervousness about the mission and it having bad luck because of the number 13 is authentically depicted in the movie. Even more so when it's reinforced by this little moment with Marilyn's wedding ring that really did take place a day before the launch.
I was taking a shower and it just slipped right off my hand and it went into the drain, and I just was terrified because to me it was like an omen that something really was going to happen.
Now, I'm not exactly a superstitious guy, but I do think it's kind of funny how NASA was almost tempting fate. And that's because Apollo 13 was scheduled to launch on April 11th, 1970 at 13 past 1, or in military lingo, 13:13. The reason for this was simply just because the timing presented the most optimal conditions that day. NASA was treating it like any other mission, and aside from a bumpy start with one of the engines at liftoff that was quickly corrected, everything was above board and just routine.
There's nothing routine about flying to the moon, I can vouch for that.
I totally agree with you, mate. Unfortunately, the public at the time didn't see it that way. The thing is, by Apollo 13, people were so used to NASA landing men on the moon that they were just bored by it. Apparently, they found it so boring that no news network wanted to show Apollo 13's live TV broadcast.
All the networks come to us. One of them said we made going to the moon about as exciting as taking a trip to Pittsburgh.
Now, I understand that the Beatles broke up the day before, and yes, that was headline news, but seriously, how lame is that? I can't help but feel a little annoyed with how good everyone had it back then. And it's sad to think that arguably the most memorable thing that NASA's done since the Apollo program is this.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade.
Anyway, about 6 minutes after their live TV broadcast, which nobody watched, Mission Control asked Jack Swigert to stir the hydrogen and oxygen tanks in the service module.
Hey, we've got a problem here.
What did you do? Nothing. I stirred the tanks.
What the crew of Apollo 13 and Mission Control didn't know at the time was that the insulation covering the wires inside oxygen tank number 2 had accidentally melted off during a dress rehearsal a few weeks before. So when Jack Swigert flipped the switch, a spark from an exposed wire caused a fire and ignited the highly concentrated oxygen tanks. Back at Mission Control, the readings on their computers were going off the chart when they received that famous radio message.
Houston, we have a problem.
Now, that famous line was actually shortened in the movie. What was actually said was,
Houston, we've had a problem.
With all the confusion, Mission Control thought the problem had to be instrumental, since so many things were going wrong at once, whilst the Apollo 13 crew thought they had been hit by a meteor. This was just for the first few minutes, until Jim Lovell looked out the window.
We are venting something out into space.
I can see it outside of window 1 right now.
This was extremely bad. The oxygen supply wasn't just used for breathing, it was also mixed with the hydrogen in the fuel cells to generate water and power. One tank was completely depleted and the second was bleeding oxygen very quickly. In order to hold the flow, Houston decided that the reactant feed valves from the two fuel cells had to be closed. And when they gave the order to Apollo 13, it crushed them, because it could only mean one thing.
We just lost the moon.
The reason why was because once they had shut down those valves, they couldn't be turned back on again. They also knew that they needed two fuel cells to land on the moon. What little oxygen they had left was in the command module's small reserve tank. But the real problem wasn't that they could no longer land on the moon, but if they can make it back home alive. The command module by this point would be out of oxygen and power within minutes. To conserve as much as they could for re-entry in Earth's atmosphere, they had to shut it down and move themselves into the lunar module, or LEM, and use it as a lifeboat. But before they could do that, they had to transfer vital data from the command module's computers onto the LEM's computers. Now the good thing about the LEM is that it had its own supply of power and oxygen. Just in the nick of time, the crew achieved everything they needed to do and moved into the LEM. Whilst all this was going on, Apollo 13's mission was finally making headline news. People all around the world watched as reports came in of how perilous the situation was. There was a very real possibility that Lovell, Hayes and Swaggart would make another record for the history books, to be the first Americans to die in space. But the crew didn't have the luxury or the time to contemplate their odds. After they corrected their course, they had to focus on the next problem. With extremely limited power, how could they return to Earth?
The only engine we've got with enough power for a direct abort is the SPS on the service module. What Lovell has told us, it could have been damaged in an explosion, so let's consider that engine dead. We light that thing up, could blow the whole works. Just too risky.
So what was decided instead was to have Apollo 13 continue to the moon. There, they would use the moon's gravity to pull them into orbit, and with a brief engine burn from the LEM, it would slingshot them back to Earth. But there was also another issue. Mission Control knew that without being able to use the engine from the service module, Apollo 13's journey back would take much longer. The thing is, the LEM was built to land on the moon, but was designed to only support 2 men for 2 days. And based on their close proximity to the moon already, the LEM's weak engine burn would instead take them 4 days to return to Earth, meaning the very real possibility that they could run out of water, power and air long before they reached it. As Apollo 13 approached the moon's orbit, the film appropriately shows this very somber scene when the astronauts look at the moon out the window.
No one buzzes this old neighborhood. Coming up on Mount Maryland. Jim, you gotta take a look at this.
I've seen it.
I honestly can't even begin to imagine how gut-wrenching that must be. To be that close to the moon, closer than most people have ever been, only to see it slip away. As Apollo 13 reappeared from the far side of the moon, the crew fired the LEM's engine directly into Earth. And then afterwards, to conserve all the power they possibly could for life support, communication, and later for re-entry, Houston told them to switch off all non-critical systems, including the heating. Eventually it got so cold in there that it was like being in a fridge. The duration of their journey back to Earth would be an extreme discomfort, as it would be too cold to sleep and their food and water would freeze. But to ensure their survival, they had to do it. With power consumption taken care of, the next problem that had to be fixed was how to deal with the carbon dioxide building up in the spacecraft. Now normally they would use lithium hydroxide canisters which filter carbon dioxide to make the air breathable. And they did have plenty on board from both the command module and the lunar module, but there was a serious design flaw.
We had a CO2 filter problem on the lunar module. 5 filters on the LEM. We commit for 2 guys for a day and a half. I told the doc.
You're already up to 8 on the gauges. Anything over 15 and you get impaired judgment, blackouts, the beginnings of brain asphyxia.
What about the scrubbers on the command module?
They take square cartridges. The ones on the LEM are round.
So the engineers back on Earth, using nothing but the equipment available on Apollo 13, had to figure out how to fit a square peg into a round hole. Amazingly, a solution was found with duct tape, part of a flight manual, and some plastic bags. They were able to direct the astronauts over the radio on how to recreate the process. For the next few days, Apollo 13 drifted onwards to Earth, as its crew struggled with freezing conditions, lack of sleep, and dehydration. On the 6th day, Earth was finally beginning to fill their windows. In preparation for this, Houston told them a new course correction was needed, as the angle they were approaching was too shallow, meaning that they would skim the Earth's atmosphere and bounce off into space. Unfortunately, they still couldn't power up their computers yet to give them a reading, so they would have to fly blind and use a visual reference. The stars can be counted on as there was still a lot of debris floating outside, so instead they used the Earth itself. Keeping it in the window, the whole crew had to work together by firing the LEM's engine for the precise duration needed as they flew manually. They only had a matter of seconds to study the spacecraft as it pitched and yawed from the force of the engine.
A little more, come on, baby.
That's it, hold it, hold it. Damn it. Back, that's it, hold it. Steady.
9.
Shut down.
Just in the nick of time, they had achieved the correct angle they needed. The next and final step was to prepare for re-entry. Both Mission Control and the crew had been anticipating this nervously. The command module had never been powered down before in flight, and with it being exposed to the cold vacuum of space for so long, the main concern was whether it could even be turned back on. And then there was also the issue about the buildup of condensation. Everything inside was absolutely covered with droplets of water, from the walls, the floors, the ceiling, and the control panels. And there was a very good chance that condensation was building up behind the control panels too. The possibility of a short circuit wasn't far from everyone's mind. Fortunately, all the systems were switched on without incident, and the spacecraft came to life. Next, they disconnected the service module, and as it drifted off, the crew could now see what the damage had been from the explosion.
One whole side of this
Spacecraft is missing. Right by the high gain antenna, a whole panel is blown out. Right up to our heat shield.
Reason why everyone was so concerned was that if the heat shield had been at all compromised, then the astronauts would most likely burn up in Earth's atmosphere. But there was nothing they could do about it. Only a few hours left until re-entry. All they could do now was hope for the best. With everything ready to go, the crew moved into the command module and disconnected the LEM, the portion of the ship that had protected them for so long throughout the entire ordeal. The command module then began to descend into the atmosphere. The whole world held its breath as it watched everything unfold on the news, hoping and praying that the angle was still good, that the heat shield hadn't been damaged, and the parachutes hadn't frozen in space. The time it would take for Mission Control to know if Apollo 13 had made it was calculated to be around 3 minutes. Reason why is because communications are temporarily disrupted in re-entry within that time frame due to the extreme buildup of heat and the ionization of the gases around the spacecraft. The command module rose to temperatures of 5,000 degrees as it hurled towards the Earth, going 25,000 miles an hour. 3 minutes went by and still not a word. Seconds began to drag as the blackout continued. And then, after 6 minutes, a voice emerged from the radio.
Hello, Houston. This is Honesty. It's good to see you again.
Against all odds, the crew of Apollo 13 returned safely. The heat shield withstood the intense heat of re-entry, and the parachutes had successfully deployed. The extra delay in the blackout was caused by the command module coming in at a shallower angle, but otherwise they had made it. They splashed down to the South Pacific Ocean, where the USS Iwo Jima was waiting for them with a rescue crew. All over the world, people let out a huge sigh of relief as they watched the live TV broadcast. Later, Apollo 13's mission would be called a successful failure. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert may have been denied their chance to walk on the moon, but the return home is nonetheless a true victory, made possible by the extraordinary professionalism and dedication by Mission Control and each other. As you all know, I'm not exactly fond of inaccuracies, Almost every historical movie has them, but most of them are justified to enhance the drama within the story. Sometimes it's just an excuse to cover up sloppy writing, but Apollo 13 is a rare example where I happen to agree with most of the inaccuracies presented on screen. But don't get me wrong, these moments are far and few between. They really did do a fantastic job to try and be as faithful to the real-life story as possible, but only to an extent. You see, if they made this particular movie to be too authentic, then it really would have been boring to watch. In Apollo 13's case, the movie not only has to be authentic, but has to convey to the audience what is going on in the simplest way possible. Obviously, we can't understand every single thing said in the movie since we are clearly not astronauts and can't even pretend to understand the complexity of half the stuff they're talking about. That's why throughout the film, some of the high-tech jargon is simplified. But even that sometimes is not enough, because as human beings, what we tend to respond to most are visuals. This is the reason why the film feels like it has to almost spell things out for us.
So you're telling me you can only give our guys 45 hours? That brings them to about there.
We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that.
In all honesty, I imagine that most of these guys were completely up to speed with one another, and most likely talking a mile a minute. But as long as we, the audience, get a generally good idea of what's going on, then it's absolutely justified in my opinion. Another thing is, if we can't understand the gravity of the situation behind what's being said, we can certainly pick it up by the emotions our main characters convey.
All I did was stir those tanks.
What was that gauge reading before you hit the switch?
Hey, don't tell me how to fly the damn CM, all right?
You don't
They brought
even
me in
know,
here
do you?
to do a job. They asked me to stir the damn tanks, and I stirred the tank.
Now, just to let you know, this confrontation absolutely never happened. In fact, there were no confrontations of any kind that took place on Apollo 13. Despite the discomforts and the dangers they had to endure, cooperation between the crew members was never an issue. They were all in this together, and focusing on anything else was just a waste of time.
I'm not gonna go bouncing off the walls for 10 minutes, and we're just gonna end up right back here with the same problem. Trying to figure out how to stay alive.
This possible suggestion of Jack Swagget being incompetent is totally fabricated in the movie. I mean, like, how in the hell was he supposed to know that the oxygen tank was gonna explode just by flipping a switch? If there was even a slight chance that he wasn't up to the task, do you really think he would even be in outer space to begin with? These emotional outbursts that occur throughout the film obviously didn't happen, but they're meant to heighten the drama and to emphasize the stress and the toll it was having on these astronauts. They're freezing cold, they've had no sleep, and they're suffering with throbbing headaches because of their lack of oxygen. Any one of us would quite naturally be bitching and moaning, but the fact that these guys never did really does emphasize how they were the best of the best. However, in the movie, we see people frequently snap at each other, whether it be on board Apollo 13 or even back in Houston.
They're working on it now.
I'll call over to the simulator and get an estimate.
God damn it! I don't want another estimate. I want the procedure. Now!
This is actually where history works against the movie, because not once did Gene Kranz ever snap at any of his crew, nor did any of the astronauts snap at Houston.
Aquarius, watch that middle gimbal.
We don't want you tugging off in space. Well, inform Houston, I'm well aware of the goddamn gimbals.
If you actually listen to the real audio from Apollo 13 and compare it to what is portrayed in the movie, then you will be amazed to discover how absolutely calm the real guys were, even during the most intense scene in the entire movie.
Houston, we have a problem. We have a main bus B undervolt. We've got a lot of thruster activity here, Houston. It just went offline. Oh, there's another master alarm, Houston.
Houston, we've had a problem. Main B bus undervolt. Roger, main B undervolt. Stand by, 13, we're looking at it.
I'm checking the quad.
Christ, that was no repress valve.
Maybe it's in quad C.
We've got a computer restart.
I'm gonna reconfigure the RCS.
We've got a
When
ping
these things
light.
fire, it doesn't make any sense.
We got multiple caution and warning, Houston.
Okay, right now, Houston, the voltage is looking good. We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
So we got a pretty large bang there associated with a master alarm. Shit, it's main bus A.
Jesus. It's like the heart rates are skyrocketing.
Interim here, we're starting to go ahead and button up the tunnel again.
Now, I swear that I didn't just look for the most boring clips I could find. This is pretty much consistent with all their rushes. Although it doesn't sound like there's very much going on, they're actually performing some very nail-biting stuff. The fact that Mission Control and the crew of Apollo 13 were able to keep their cool throughout the entire ordeal is nothing short of astonishing. But I think it's fair to say that if Apollo 13 was 100% accurate with how these guys actually talked, then most audience members would fall asleep. Instead, the authenticity comes from the events seen in the movie, and especially the visuals. For example, to get the actors to have cold breath, they would freeze the set to about 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.6 degrees Celsius. There's also the re-entry sequence, which I absolutely love, when the command module began to heat up, all the condensation dripped away. The real Jim Lovell described it by saying that it rained inside the CM, and in the movie we actually see it. But the most authentic parts of Apollo 13, without a doubt, are the zero gravity sequences. And the reason why they're so convincing is because they're real. During production, NASA allowed the filmmakers special use of their reduced gravity aircraft, the KC-135. On board the plane, they had built smaller versions of the set for the actors to work in, and as the plane descended sharply, the cast and the crew were able to experience nearly 25 seconds of weightlessness.
When you're weightless, it feels like you've just been spun upside down. All the blood goes into your head, and it feels like when you're in a Rocco plane at the amusement park, it just feels like you just got spun upside down. You think suddenly, you think, hey, I'm upside down. No, I'm not. What's wrong? Why is it different? Oh, I'm floating.
Seriously, how awesome is that? Now let's discuss some of the inaccuracies. One big moment in the film is when the astronauts climb into the lunar module and use it as a lifeboat, whilst the guys back in Houston rack their brains on how to make it support 3 men for 4 days instead of what it was designed to do, which was 2 men for 2 days. Now, whilst all this is true, the movie does make it appear that Mission Control improvised a lot of the stuff on the fly. In reality, NASA had already simulated this lifeboat procedure before. In that scenario, they pretended that something had contaminated the atmosphere in the command module, and the crew had to get into the LEM and vent everything out. So during the Apollo 13 mission, people already remember that exercise when everything was going badly. In fact, it's probably because of that these astronauts survived. There was also another similar example in the film when the problem came with the carbon dioxide filters from the command module and the LEM. In preparation for the Apollo 8 mission, there had been another simulation where a cabin fan had been jammed due to a loose screw. To fix the problem, they used a vacuum cleaner from the command module and some cut-up plastic bags and taped it to the lithium hydroxide canisters and blew through it with a vacuum cleaner. So, again, during the Apollo 13 mission, people were like, hey, do you remember that simulation we did back on 8? And then, of course, there's the big moments in the film where it seems that Ken Mattingly single-handedly saves the day by figuring out how to find more power for the command module when his crew on 13 need to turn everything on. In reality, that simulation was more of a verification of an already written process. A bunch of guys had already worked it out and written down the procedures to do it. So the simulation was actually done to confirm whether the numbers were right. Knowing the truth, of course, shouldn't take away your enjoyment of the movie, as I feel that it was necessary to condense a lot of what happened. I mean, you have to remember that these guys were out in space for several days. And the last big inaccuracy in the movie that I can think of is when we see the crew begin to suffer the effects of carbon dioxide poisoning. We see Jack Swigert have blurry vision and he's having trouble thinking. Now, whilst it's true that there was a buildup of CO2 inside the spacecraft before they fixed the filters, it was never as dangerously high as the film suggests. Otherwise, the astronauts would have been unable to carry out their complicated tasks. You see, when you get CO2 poisoning, your brain is starved of oxygen, and the less you have, the more incapacitated you become, before you eventually die from it. This is just another example of the film heightening up the drama to inform the audience with its visuals the dangers our astronauts face. As a historical film, Apollo 13 is damn near perfect in its execution. It stays as true to real-life events as it possibly can, and by doing so, is able to shine a light on the incredible deeds carried out by Apollo 13 and Mission Control. It is indeed a tribute to this amazing period in time. And most of the inaccuracies I've presented in this review are, in my opinion, justified in the movie. People may not have shouted at each other, they may not have been reeling from the effects of CO2, but the stresses and the dangers they faced were very real indeed. And the fact they were able to stay calm and collected throughout the entire ordeal speaks volumes about their professionalism. And you can clearly see the effort made in making this film. You get a sense of a genuine enthusiasm and a great love of history. So much so that it literally bleeds out of the screen. And this is all I want from a historical picture. I just want the filmmakers to care as much about the history as I do. Because when they do, you get a real classic on your hands. People will watch it and understand why Apollo 13 is referenced as NASA's finest hour. A lot of Americans will watch this film and they will feel proud, not just of Apollo 13, but what their country accomplished for all of mankind in the space race, as rightfully they should. I also feel that sense of pride for them, but I also feel a tinge of regret. It's sad to think that humanity's greatest achievement, landing on the moon, was nearly 50 years ago, half a century. 2001 has come and gone, and although we have iPads and we have Skype, we're still no closer to Stanley Kubrick's vision of the future, a film he made before Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon. He made it in a time when people were optimistic about what the next century would bring in interplanetary travel. We still have yet to see that future. The last time humanity was on another celestial body was on the moon in 1972. And I sincerely hope that, within our lifetime, we might return to it again. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about Apollo 13. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time. Hello and welcome, History Buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and in this episode, I'll be covering one of my favorite movies of all time, Dances with Wolves. This is an American epic that truly deserves the name epic. The first time I watched this film as a kid, it captured my imagination and instilled in me a fascination I've carried with me ever since of Native American history. The story of Dances with Wolves is about a lieutenant called John J. Dunbar who was posted out on the frontier during the American Civil War. It's there that he comes into contact with a band of Lakota Sioux, and over the course of the film he establishes a relationship with them, eventually even be accepted as one of their own. All the while at the back of his mind he is aware that the Sioux and their way of life will soon be under threat. And if this story sounds at all familiar to you, then it's probably because of other movies like The Last Samurai or Avatar. But in my opinion, this is the film that did it right the first time. But enough of me rambling, let's instead dive right in. Over the course of this review, I'm going to be discussing the historical setting of the film, how historically accurate it is, and in great detail explore the history of the Sioux. This is Dances with Wolves. The story of Dances with Wolves begins in 1863, during the American Civil War. The main protagonist is a lieutenant in the Union Army, John J. Dunbar. For his heroic action in a battle in Tennessee, he is awarded a citation and a military posting of his choosing.
Actually, sir, I'm here at my own request. Really? Why? I've always wanted to see the frontier.
Do you want to see the frontier?
Yes, sir. Before it's gone.
Now, what does Dunbar mean by this exactly? What was the frontier and why was it disappearing? Well, by 1863, the east coast of the United States had been fully settled and the eyes of the American people civilized. But the same could not be said for the great interior that separated the east coast from the west. Much of it was still untouched. 500,000 square miles of grassland known as the Great Plains stretched all the way from Canada right down to Texas, almost entirely covered with nothing much more than prairie. Just like you see here, from horizon to horizon, it was an ocean of grass, and Dances with Wolves absolutely nails the scope of the Great Plains with its cinematography. The panoramic shots we see in the movie are easily reminiscent of other great epics, such as Lawrence of Arabia. Now today, most of the Great Plains has been cultivated into farmland, but there are still some places where you can go to see what it used to look like, and these were some of the locations used in the film. Now, a great feature of this once incredible landscape were the massive herds of migrating buffalo. Around 30 million of them roamed across the prairie. These herds were so big that they literally stopped trains in their tracks for 2 days as they passed through. They were so massive that they would tear the land up during their stampedes.
A gigantic swath of torn up ground extending to the horizon. The sheer numbers it took to create this impossible image was hard to imagine.
For thousands of years, the prairie provided the perfect feeding ground for the buffalo, creating a symbiotic relationship. Seeds from the very grass they grazed upon would cling to the buffalo's shaggy coat. Over the seasons, the herds would migrate across the North American continent, propagating the land where they went. Now, right up into the early 1800s, the Great Plains were, for the most part, unknown and untouched. But it wasn't uninhabited. It was populated by Native Americans from many different tribes. Altogether, they make up the Plains Nations. Just to name a few, there was the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, and of course, the Sioux. Each tribe had its own language, their own unique culture and traditions. But the biggest thing they all shared in common was the buffalo they hunted. It was what drew the tribes to live on the plains and provided for them clothing, shelter, tools, and food. Now, before horses came into the picture, Native Americans had to hunt the buffalo on foot, which was an extremely long and dangerous process. In order to get close to the herd, they would cover themselves with animal skins. They would crawl along the ground, patiently stalking their prey. They would then either ambush individual buffalo, or, with careful timing, they would drive herds into traps or off the edges of corrals and cliffs. This was the way many of the original inhabitants of the plains hunted for thousands of years. But then everything changed in the 1600s when the Spanish reintroduced horses to North America. It pretty much revolutionized their entire society overnight. On horseback, they were able to cover much wider range. They could follow the herds as they migrated, and they were able to kill the buffalo much more efficiently. And you could see here, in the film's buffalo hunt sequence, they did a phenomenal job of showing us what it actually used to look like. They used Native American stuntmen who were riding bareback and firing their arrows as they're galloping behind the herd, exactly the same way how their ancestors used to. Another cool thing I like to mention is that they used 3,000 buffaloes for the set piece. I can't even begin to imagine how nerve-wracking it must have been shooting all of this. Because once 3,000 buffaloes start running, it's kind of hard to make them stop. You have to remember that these are the largest animals in North America, and they can weigh over 2,000 pounds or 900 kilograms. But regardless of the safety hazards or the logistical nightmare this had to have been, it was absolutely worth it. When I watch this scene, I get goosebumps and I just sit back in awe. So anyway, like I was saying before, it was the reintroduction of the horse that changed everything. Now presented with new hunting possibilities and countless herds of buffalo, tribes from all directions poured into the Great Plains and made it their home. Many of these tribes would abandon farming and village life to become nomadic horsemen, including one of the most famous of all the Plains Indians, relative newcomers to the scene who arrived in the Great Plains in the 18th century, the Sioux. Collectively, they make up the Great Sioux Nation, and in their tongue, they are known as Achetisacoan, which means 7 council fires. It's a confederation of allied bands made up of 3 different groups, Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. The ones in Dances with Wolves are Lakota, and the movie makes a great effort to authentically portray them. The costumes, for example, are based on actual historical accounts and made out of the same materials that the Lakota would have used.
These
costumes were all hand-designed, all done with natural tanned leather, stuff like that. Natural tanned buffalo hide, and the smell of natural tan stuff, it's intoxicating, it's wonderful.
The teepees are made out of buffalo hides, their shade and color is accurate, the size of the camp is also correct for how large this particular sub-tribe is, and the film also gives us an idea of just how mobile Sioux camps and villages were. How at the drop of a hat they could just pick up and go.
In the time it took to gather my things at Sedgwick, the entire tribe was well on its way. The efficiency of the people and the speed at which they moved was enough to impress any military commander.
But aside from the costumes, the sets, and the buffalo, what the film really deserves credit for in its mission for authenticity is recreating the Lakota language, which, unfortunately, is in its heyday. Only a few thousand people today are still fluent in it. Certainly none of the cast or extras could speak it because many of them were from different tribes which speak different languages. The woman who made it all possible is the late Doris Leader-Charge. Before Dances with Wolves, she worked at a community college in the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, teaching Lakota language and culture. Due to her experience as a college professor, she became the dialogue coach for the entire cast. In fact, in the movie, she has a small speaking part as Pretty Shield, the wife of Chief Ten Bears. Now, I'm sure that under Doris's supervision, the cast did a bang-up job in speaking Lakota, but I wouldn't be surprised if their pronunciation wasn't spot on all the time, which is completely understandable. I mean, after all, they aren't really Lakota. But in this quick scene, we can hear 100% authentic Lakota being spoken by Doris Leader-Charge. And what's really beautiful to think about is that now it's forever preserved in this film.
She didn't let her language die, and her spirit lives on, both in this film and in the people that she's touched. She ensured for her people that her language would live on in this movie, and she ensured for herself that her presence will never die.
So now that I've given you a fair idea of what the frontier was like and how much of an amazing place it was, we can now go into some detail about what Dunbar was talking about wanting to see the frontier before it's gone. You see, the reason why the Great Plains hadn't really been settled yet was because it wasn't much of a desirable location. There was very little water or trees around, just endless prairie. And then there's, of course, the crazy freaky weather. Aside from scorching summers and freezing winters, the Great Plains also were home to some of the worst thunderstorms on Earth, with violent tornadoes ripping through the land. Most pioneers avoided the idea of settling the plains altogether, and in huge numbers passed right through in search of greener pastures, so to speak. They instead had their eyes upon the western coast, like California and Oregon, where good farmland could be found. On May 22, 1843, roughly 1,000 emigrants departed from Elm Grove, Missouri on wagon trains pulled by oxen. Their destination was western Oregon. Their 2,000-mile journey would take them right through the Great Plains and lasted between 4 to 6 months. This year was to be dubbed the Great Migration of 1843. As the years went on, more and more wagon trains followed, trailblazing through the famous route that was to be known as the Oregon Trail. However, things really began to pick up in numbers when in January 1848, James Marshall discovered gold in the Sierra Nevada, sparking off the California gold rush. In staggering numbers, prospectors flooded the Great Plains to seek their fortune in California. Within the first 20 months, 100,000 would travel along the Oregon Trail, and many more would follow, even after the California gold rush ended in 1855. Between 1841 and 1866, 350,000 people would pass through the Great Plains. So it's no surprise in Dances with Wolves that numbers such as these would weigh heavily on Dunbar's mind.
We talk every day, but I know Kickingbird is frustrated with me. He always wants to know how many more white people are coming. I tell him that the white people will most likely pass through this country and nothing more. But I am speaking in half-truths. One day there will be too many, but I cannot bring myself to tell him that.
The half-truths he's speaking of was just when the pioneers were using the Oregon Trail to get to the West Coast. But he clearly knows that things aren't going to stay that way for very long. That one advantage the Great Plains had was its lack of natural resources to make it an attractive place to settle. But that was soon to change. By 1863, the Transcontinental Railway was being constructed, one that would connect the East Coast to the West and seriously cut down the time it would take to travel the distance. Whereas the wagon train would take 6 months, by train it would take 6 days, and would bring with it all the essential supplies pioneers would need to settle the Great Plains. It was finally finished on May 10th, 1869. Aside from the railway, there was one other thing Dunbar neglected to mention to Kickingbird. On May 20th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Homestead Act. The act encouraged any farmer over the age of 21 to move out west with their family and claim 160 acres of free federal land. All the settlers had to do was pay a small fee, live on the property for 5 years, and if their farm was successful, then it was theirs. By the end of the Civil War, 15,000 homesteads would be claimed, with much more to follow once the railway had been completed. Eventually, that number would rise up to 1.6 million and would cover 420,000 square miles. As I said before, I really do love Dances with Wolves. It's one of my favorite films of all time, but even I have to admit that there are some inaccuracies in it that need to be mentioned. So first off, I'm going to begin with some interesting things that caught my attention with the characters during my research, and then later I'll move on to the inaccuracies. Now, I'm aware that Dances with Wolves is based on the book of the same name, written by Michael Blake, who also wrote the screenplay for the movie. It's a great piece of historical fiction, and it doesn't pretend to be based on any true events. Nevertheless, I thought it was worth trying to see if any of the characters of the movie are based on real historical figures. It was a complete shot in the dark, but funnily enough, I actually came up with some results. For example, when I looked up the character of Kickingbird, I actually discovered that there was a Kickingbird, but unlike his movie counterparts, he wasn't Lakota Sioux. He was a high chief of the Kiowa tribe based out of Oklahoma. There was also a real-life 10 Bears, but just like Kickingbird, he wasn't Lakota Sioux either. He was a principal chief of the Comanche. And I was able to find mention of a real John Dunbar, but he wasn't a Civil War vet who lived amongst the Lakota Sioux, but instead he was a missionary who lived amongst the Pawnee. So what do these historical figures have to do with the movie? Absolutely nothing. Like, either this is the biggest coincidence I've ever discovered during my research, or Michael Blake just randomly picked 3 names from a history book. However, I'm not insinuating that these are inaccuracies, I just thought it was funny to point out. But in any case, there is at least one character in the movie that is loosely based on a real person, and that is Stands with a Fist. For those of you who haven't seen Dances with Wolves, she is the white adopted daughter of Kickingbird. In a flashback sequence, we see her family get slaughtered by the Pawnee. She's able to escape, and then later we find out that she was rescued by the Lakota and became part of their tribe, speaking their language, adopting their culture, and in the process, losing her identity as a white American. Now, this was generally common practice amongst Plains Indians. They kidnapped women and children to replenish their numbers in order to ensure their survival as a group, and they would assimilate and become part of the tribe. Like I said, this happened all the time. Now, just coming back to Stands with a Fist, her character is based on the true story of Cynthia Ann Parker. On May 19, 1836, in Fort Parker, Texas, a war party of Comanche and their native allies attacked Cynthia's community when she was around 10 years old. With most of her family slaughtered, Cynthia was taken captive by the Comanche and lived with them for 24 years. Like Stands with a Fist, she was adopted by the Comanche and became a full member of their tribe. She married a chief and bore him 3 children, one of which was the last free Comanche chief, Quanah Parker. So that takes care of the characters. Now let's get into the inaccuracies. They mostly have to do with the scenes when Dunbar starts interacting with the Sioux.
I believe I made an even greater impression on their next visit. I produced a coffee grinder, something none of them had seen before.
Now, I'm sorry to say this, but I have a little bit of a hard time in believing that these guys have never seen or tasted coffee before, or even sugar for that matter. And that's simply just because of trade. Native Americans, as well as the Sioux, would have had access to coffee for centuries. If they didn't get it from other tribes, then they would have gotten it from white traders. Just imagine this scenario. You're a fur trader and you're interested in getting some beaver pelts from your local Indians. You want to establish a good business relationship and start things off on the right foot. So what do you offer? A cup of coffee. Simple and classic. So I'm just getting this feeling that the movie's indicating that Dunbar is the first white man this particular band has spoken to, which is actually kind of impressive if you think about it, because how did they miss all the hundreds of thousands of white people crossing their lands during the California Gold Rush? I just imagine they would have made contact with someone, but I guess not. I mean, that's why we see another oh wow moment when Kicking Bird looks through a telescope for the first time. However, these inaccuracies are all relatively harmless compared to this next one. It's when the movie possibly suggests the idea that the Sioux had very little knowledge of firearms.
I have guns. Mazawaka, Ota Blue Hayela. Lila. Lila, Ota Blue Hayela.
Ata for?
Yes.
Akichita Ota Ekta.
Lila, Lila, Kayuza Yelo. Mazawaka, Wanji, Wichasha, Nupi, Ipiki Yellow.
Okay, for the record, this is a really stupid moment in the movie because the Sioux were very familiar with guns. They had them, they used them, and they came up against them. For example, the Dakota Sioux were fighting a war against the US government in the Dakota War of 1862. That's just 1 year before this movie takes place. In this painting depicting the attack on New Ulm, you can clearly see that all the Sioux are packing heat. Not to mention the Colorado War, in which the Lakota Sioux played a major role, also against the US government. It was fought between 1863 and 1865. Just keep in mind that this is during the time that Dances with Wolves is set, and yet in the movie, Dunbar has to remind one Lakota warrior how to use a gun.
Shoot the gun!
It's just kind of patronizing if you ask me. Because what I'm trying to say is that the Sioux, like all Native Americans, were very familiar with firearms. Ever since the mid-17th century, guns have been the highest thing sought for in trades and raids. And after a few hundred years of fighting off European and American imperialism, I think it's safe to say that they might know a thing or two about guns. So, the next topic I would like to discuss is one where Dances with Wolves draws a little bit of criticism over its portrayal of the Pawnee. Some people make the somewhat understandable complaint that the Pawnee are made to look like the cliched villainous bad guys, whilst the Sioux are shown in a more favorable light. I personally think that one small reason why is because the leader of the Pawnee is played by Wes Studi, and everyone remembers his role in The Last of the Mohicans, where he played the villain Magua. Shut up. Anyway, the reason why some people complain is because in real life, the Pawnee were a much smaller tribe that was often being attacked and oppressed by the larger and more powerful Sioux. In fact, the Pawnee by this point were in pretty bad shape. Up until 1830, they were pretty isolated from European interaction, and as a result, hadn't been exposed to the host of diseases that normally came with it. And then in 1830-31, they were hit by a smallpox epidemic, losing at least one half of their population in one winter. Each time they made it through one epidemic, they would be hit again by another, dealing with smallpox one moment and then with cholera the next. And then if that's not bad enough, they were also being attacked by the Sioux and the Cheyenne and being pressed by the expanding American frontier to the east. To give you an idea of how bad their losses were, between 1857 and 1876, their population had dropped to less than 2,000 people. But as to the criticism that the Sioux are comparatively shown in a more favorable light, I don't really feel that's fair. I mean, the main reason why we sympathize with the Sioux is because Dunbar sympathizes with the Sioux, and it makes sense because he's friends with them. We are seeing the Sioux through his eyes, and he only really met them recently.
A war party is going against the Pawnee soon, and I've asked to go. I sense that I made a mistake in doing so, but I could not bring myself to take it back. They are my friends, and from what little I gather, the Pawnee have been very hard on these people.
So what I quite like is that we don't see the Sioux openly lie or demonize the Pawnee to Dunbar in any way. His interpretation of the Pawnee are really his own without any given context.
Kicking Bird wants to know why you want to make war on the Pawnee. They have done nothing to you.
They are Sioux enemies.
And the last inaccuracy I'd like to get into is one that I didn't even know was one. It was only something I picked up during my research, and it actually took me by surprise. It's the very heartbreaking scene where Dunbar and the Lakota hunting party come across slain buffalo, where dozens of carcasses are littered across the prairie with only their tongues and hides taken, whilst the rest are left to rot in the sun. The images you see in the film are very authentic. Compare them against actual photographs taken, and it's exactly the same. Unfortunately though, Dances with Wolves jumps the gun a little bit, since it only takes place in 1863. Whilst the buffalo were hunted in fairly large numbers, it was only for their meat and not for their hides and tongues. Commercial hunting like this wouldn't take place until around 1870-71, when tanners discovered a new way of turning buffalo hides into usable leather. And by 1870, there was a shortage of leather needed for belts to be used in factories, and America's industrial sector had an insatiable demand for quality buffalo hide, one that led to their near extinction. The man you see in that famous picture, for example, Charles Rath, is sitting on top of 40,000 buffalo hides, ready to be taken back east. In total, he bought or sold more than 1 million hides and several carloads of buffalo tongues. So, knowing all of that, does this inaccuracy bother me? And in my personal opinion, no it doesn't. Even though the timing of events is incorrect by several years, the film is taking a great effort to authentically depict them and the devastating effect this would have on the Sioux and the Great Plains themselves. A way of life that existed for centuries for the Plains Indians was soon coming to an end. And we get to witness that devastation through the characters and, for a moment, reflect on how much worse it must have been in real life. So does this film take creative license? Absolutely. I think Dances with Wolves is trying to do a balancing act between showing the Lakota Sioux in their prime to when things started going really badly for them. And to put it rather obviously, the transition didn't occur in 1 year. It was a gradual process over many years. And aside from the gun scenes and arguably the portrayal of the Pawnee, I find many of these inaccuracies to be harmless. What Dances with Wolves does exceptionally well is its honest, authentic portrayal of the Lakota Sioux and, in some ways, all Native Americans. Throughout history, they've been demonized as bloodthirsty savages, and for a good chunk of Western films, they were the bad guys. And in Dances with Wolves, we get to see their side of the story, their version of American history, and we get to see them for who they really are, as human beings.
Nothing I've been told about these people is correct. They are not beggars and thieves. They are not the boogeymen they have been made out to be. I'd never known a people so eager to laugh, so devoted to family, so dedicated to each other. And the only word that came to mind was harmony.
Well, that about covers everything I wanted to say about Dances with Wolves. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you do. Now, normally, I would be wrapping up the review right about now. I've gone into detail about the history behind the film, I've discussed its inaccuracies, and given my personal take on why I believe Dances with Wolves is such a wonderful film. But on this occasion, for this video, I would like to change things up a bit and take this opportunity to explore the history of the Sioux that goes beyond the setting of the film. So for any of you who only wanted to see my review of Dances with Wolves and hear about its inaccuracies or even my opinion about it, then I think it's best just to let you know now that I won't be continuing any further on that. However, if you're still interested in learning a little bit more history, then please feel free to stick around as we have a lot to cover. So, where do we start? How about briefly when the movie ends? Don't worry if anyone hasn't seen it yet, it's not a major spoiler. Right before the end credit sequence, we see an epilogue that says, 13 years later, their homes destroyed, the buffalo gone, the last band of free Sioux submitted to white authority at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The great horse culture of the plains was gone, and the American frontier was soon to pass into history. Now, understandably, Dances with Wolves is working within the constraints of a feature film, and doesn't have the time to explain why it happened, how it happened, and just as important, what happened next. The story of the Sioux obviously doesn't end in 1877. A lot more hardship was on the way, so for the rest of the video, I'm going to try my best to cover all 3 points. Let's begin with the why. Now, the United States government has fought many wars against the Sioux, and the roots of these conflicts can be found in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Around about this time, the Oregon Trail was in full swing, with tens of thousands of pioneers passing through the Great Plains every year. A fur trapper called Thomas Fitzpatrick knew the plains very well, and he feared that a confrontation was inevitable between the Plains tribes and the pioneers passing through their lands. In 1849, he sent word to Washington asking for a peace conference to be held in order to avoid possible bloodshed. Washington responded and in 1851 gave Fitzpatrick the authority and permission to negotiate with the tribes at Fort Laramie, the farthest military outpost America had on the edges of the frontier. Fitzpatrick then sent out trappers, mountain men, and even Indians out to the Great Plains to track down all the tribes they could and invite them to Fort Laramie. The call was answered, and in September 1851, more than 10,000 Plains Indians came. It was one of the largest gatherings the Northern Plains had ever seen, representing tribes such as the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, the Arapaho, the Crow, the Sioux, and more. In order to accommodate everyone and the thousands of horses they brought, the conference was moved 30 miles to the east at Horse Creek. There, the negotiations for the Fort Laramie Treaty would begin. What was ultimately agreed upon was that the Plains tribes would allow the wagon trains in the Oregon Trail to pass through their lands unharmed, and the military were allowed to build a series of forts along the Oregon Trail to protect it and patrol it. In exchange, the US government officially recognized the sovereignty of the Plains nations. Here is a map of the lands reserved for the Sioux. The treaty also stated that American pioneers would not settle their lands, and that both sides would punish their own lawbreakers when they wronged the other party. And that was it. The treaty was signed, the peace pipe was passed around, all seemed to be good, and there was peace between the Sioux and the United States. That was until 1854. 3 years after the Fort Laramie Treaty, an incident occurred that could have easily been avoided. It happened when a Mormon wagon train was passing near a Brule Lakota encampment, and a straggling cow fell behind. There, the cow was taken and eaten by High Forehead, a mini-Conju Lakota warrior from another band who happened to be a guest of this one. The Mormon settler ran to the garrison of Fort Laramie and reported the incident to its senior officer. Lieutenant Fleming, unfamiliar with the terms of the treaty, spoke to the Brule Lakota chief, Conquering Bear, and demanded that he return the stolen cow and turn over its thief to be arrested. Conquering Bear couldn't give High Forehead to Lieutenant Fleming since he was a guest from another band, so instead he tried to recompense the Mormon settler with several horses. The Mormon rejected the offer, demanding $25 instead. With negotiations going nowhere, Conquering Bear returned to his village. Then Fleming ordered 2nd Lieutenant John Grattan to lead a detachment of 29 soldiers to the Brule Lakota encampment to arrest High Forehead. After a series of incompetent mistakes from Grattan and his translator, things escalated, and Grattan's soldiers opened fire on the camp. In the hail of artillery and gunfire, Chief Conquering Bear was mortally wounded. Then the soldiers had to deal with 1,200 Lakota warriors and was slaughtered to a man. This battle was dubbed by the newspapers the Grattan Massacre, and it would spark off the First Sioux War, after which more wars followed. There was the Dakota War, the Colorado War, the Powder River War, and things finally came to a head in Red Cloud's War. After 14 years of bloodshed, Washington called for a new peace conference to be held, yet again at Fort Laramie. The reason why was because Washington wanted to prioritize the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, and recent Indian attacks alarmed them greatly. So just like how the 1851 treaty was set up to protect wagon trains, the 1868 treaty was pushed through to protect regular trains. However, this new peace would come at a great cost to the Sioux, as they now had to give up more of their lands. The Great Sioux Reservation of 1851 would now shrink to this. The old boundaries were now classified as unceded Indian territory, but the Sioux still retained the right to hunt on them as long as buffalo remains there and the tribes did not interfere with the construction of railroads and travelers using overland trails. All the land within the Great Sioux Reservation, including the sacred Black Hills, would be recognized as sovereign territory, and white men were forbidden to trespass unless they were government officials. The Sioux were also promised annuities to be paid annually over the next 30 years in the form of food, clothing, and other services. The US would also provide teachers, carpenters, millers, engineers, blacksmiths, and a government agency to reside at the reservation. The idea behind this was that in order for the Sioux to survive, they needed to completely shed their nomadic ways and become basically civilized. So with the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, there was relative peace. But that peace would once again be challenged when in 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills on the Great Sioux Reservation. The United States by this point was suffering from an economic depression known as the Great Panic of 1873. Motivated by this, thousands flooded the Black Hills in search of gold, within clear violation of the treaty. Initially, the US Army tried to keep them out, but as more kept coming, Washington eventually decided that the gold was more important than keeping their word. So, in 1875, they offered to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux, and the Sioux replied with a resounding no. The Black Hills were the cultural center of their world, and, in the eyes of the Sioux, it was the last place in the lands they had left that still had true value. So the United States, not wishing to appear as the aggressors, made an ultimatum, demanding that all Sioux return to the reservation by January 31st, 1876, or be declared hostile. They did this knowing some bands wouldn't be able to make it on time as winter conditions restricted travel. These particular bands, allied with Chief Sitting Bull, ignored this order as they were scattered in the Powder River area. The deadline passed and Washington's conscience was clear, allowing them to declare war. In the late spring, the US Army launched a major offensive to force the Sioux back onto the reservation. In the first few months, the campaign wasn't going well for the Americans. The Sioux and their native allies, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, were an elusive enemy, and despite a few battles, the US Army was unable to achieve a decisive victory. But then, on June 25, 1876, in eastern Montana, a battle would be fought near the Little Bighorn River that would be one of the most famous in American history. A Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, a reputable Indian fighter, was tracking the movements of a large host that was believed to be 800 strong. With him was the 7th Cavalry, numbering up to 750 men. During a reconnaissance, he discovered a massive Sioux camp, but noticed that there were no warriors to be seen, only women and children. So seizing the opportunity, Custer and 200 of his men attacked the camp with the objective of taking the women and children as hostages. However, as the 7th Cavalry drew near on multiple sides, hundreds of warriors emerged from their teepees and attacked. Custer attempted to regroup his men, but was soon overwhelmed by over 2,000 Native Americans. Within an hour, Custer and nearly 270 of his men had been wiped out. This was to be the worst military defeat the United States suffered during the Sioux Wars. It can almost be described as America's Isandlwana, and much like the British in South Africa, their response was more or less the same. Months after Little Bighorn, the Sioux and their allies lost the war and were soon back on the reservation. The United States wasted no time in taking away the Black Hills and even more Sioux land. For over 10 years, the Sioux lived on the reservations and were almost entirely dependent on government rations. The buffalo they hunted were gone, driven to the brink of extinction by white hunters. The land they were expected to farm produced little in crops, and by 1890, the rations they depended on would be cut in half, and the Sioux were facing starvation. It was a culture in mourning with its identity and survival. And then, in 1889, a Paiute prophet in Nevada called Wovoka created a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance that spread across the western United States, including the Sioux reservations. Wovoka had a vision and told his followers that if they performed the Ghost Dance, the buffalo would return to the Great Plains, that their ancestors would come back to life, and all the land that was taken by the white man would be theirs once more. Wovoka's following grew, and tribes throughout the West took up this ritualistic dance. Hundreds to thousands at a time would gather in massive circles. They would sing and dance for hours and hours until they would finally collapse from exhaustion, hoping and praying that with their combined voices, they would be heard by their ancestors. Instead, they were heard by the whites. Farmers and ranchers living near reservations were terrified of the ghost dance and feared that it would encourage another Indian uprising. In response, the US War Department outlawed the ghost dance and persecuted any of its practitioners. When the ghost dance reached the Sioux reservations, the government sent thousands of troops to subdue it, including the 7th Cavalry, the same regiment that fought at the Little Bighorn. On December 28, 1890, the 7th Cavalry intercepted a band of Hunkpapa and Miniconjou Sioux headed to the Pine Ridge Reservation. In the band was 106 men and 252 women and children. The soldiers ordered them to make camp at Wounded Knee Creek. The next day, the soldiers had surrounded the encampment and ordered the Sioux to surrender their weapons. Dissatisfied with the amount of weapons procured, some of the soldiers went into the camp and started frisking the Sioux. One Miniconjou called Black Coyote was deaf and hadn't understood the order. When a group of soldiers tried to grab his gun, it accidentally went off. In the confusion, a few more shots were fired, some from the soldiers and others from 5 young Lakota who had been concealing their weapons. But in the next few seconds, things immediately escalated. The troops started firing their rifles indiscriminately into the crowd, along with 4 rapid-firing Hotchkiss cannons. Whilst the Lakota men fought back, the women and children fled the camp in panic. But even hours later, the soldiers continued to pursue them. Some bodies would be found miles away from where it all started. When the massacre was finally over, the Lakota body count was between 144 and 300. Later, the bodies were piled onto carts and dumped in a mass grave. And to add the final insult, 20 of the troopers were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked the final dark chapter of the Sioux Wars, and over 100 years later, things still haven't improved. The Sioux reservations are some of the poorest places in the United States, where alcoholism is high, where life expectancy is the second lowest in the Western Hemisphere, and 80% of the people face unemployment, 14% of homes are without electricity, and 20% of households lack running water. All of this within the richest country in the world. Needless to say, the United States hasn't done much to help, only to recognize the injustices inflicted on the Sioux.
I know that throughout history, the United States often didn't give the nation-to-nation relationship the respect that it deserved. So I promised, when I ran, to be a president who changed that. A president who honors our sacred trust, and who respects your sovereignty, and who upholds treaty obligations, and who works with you in a spirit of true partnership, in mutual respect, to give our children the future that they deserve.
You know, brother?
Fucking fuck! Medics! Get medics! Get vehicles! Get medics! Get vehicles!
Okay, I imagine some of you knew I was going to be covering this. For the rest of you who might not know what is going on in these images, let me explain. In early 2016, a Texas-based energy company called Energy Transfer Partners began construction of an oil pipeline. The $3.8 billion project would transport oil 1,100 miles from the Bakken oil fields through the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and ending its journey at an oil tank field in Illinois. Now, the controversy really began when the original proposed route of the pipeline had it crossing the Missouri River, north of the state capital, Bismarck. But the US Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency that owns much of the private land in North Dakota, rejected the route. During its environmental assessment, it concluded that the risk of an oil spill could contaminate the city's drinking water. And as nearly 500,000 barrels of crude oil will flow through it every day, I'd say that is a legitimate concern. So instead, the pipeline was to be rerouted south, and began construction to cross under Lake Oahe, just half a mile upstream from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe opposed the pipeline's path for pretty much the exact same reason why Bismarck did. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Not only would an oil spill contaminate Standing Rock's water supply, but the pipeline itself would have to pass through old Sioux lands that contain sacred sites, as well as burial mounds. And the pipeline's path would entail their destruction. And since the very beginning, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe have said no to the Army Corps of Engineers, that they didn't want the rerouted pipeline to come near their land. Now, a lot of people who are in support of the pipeline are quick to point out that it's on federal land, which is private property. But those same people refuse to consider the fact that this all used to be Sioux land. If you take into account the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, you can clearly see that it falls well within its borders. And the Sioux never gave up its land. It fought tooth and nail for them, as the United States just kept breaking treaty after treaty and taking more and more land. And the discussion of whether their land was illegally taken is not up for debate. For example, in 1980, the Supreme Court officially recognized the illegal seizure of the Black Hills in 1877 and offered to compensate the Sioux for $105 million. To this very day, the Sioux have refused to take that money, saying the land was never for sale. Today, with added interest, that money is worth $1.3 billion. So, with what little scraps of land the Sioux have left, they don't want to see it be destroyed when there's an oil spill. And yes, I did say when and not if, because the oil industry has some of the worst safety records when it comes to pipelines, and it's because they are the ones who decide how to regulate themselves.
Right now, the regulations are, to a grand degree, left up to the industry to decide themselves. Every company has a different plan. Every company's looking at risk differently. So there's lots of wiggle room in how the companies interpret the regulations.
Now, I will admit that statistically, it's safer to transport oil through a pipeline than by lorry or train. But when they do break, a hell of a lot comes out. Let's take a look, for example, at a pipeline that burst in Montana's Yellowstone River that spilled over 50,000 barrels of oil in 2015.
Right now, rising waters are complicating efforts by ExxonMobil to clean up an oil spill along the Yellowstone River in Montana.
Whoops, sorry, my bad, guys. This is quite embarrassing. That's the Yellowstone oil spill from 2011, not the one from 2015. Oh, here we go.
In a story we're following out of Montana, a pipeline breach spilled over 50,000 gallons of oil into the Yellowstone River over the weekend.
That's the one. Sorry about that, guys. I just get them confused sometimes. But I guess it points out that lightning never strikes the same place twice clearly doesn't apply to oil pipelines. I mean, just check out the safety records for oil spills by Sunoco Logistics, one of the partners behind the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Sunoco Logistics is one of the most frequent spillers of crude oil among large pipeline operators in the United States. In the past 6 years, Sunoco spilled oil more than 200 times.
Sunoco's spill rate is so bad that it is more than 2 times the industry average.
Wow. I don't know about you guys, but I think the Standing Rock Sioux tribe have a right to be worried. But it really shouldn't just be them. If the pipeline bursts, it'll go down the Missouri River and affect the drinking water for millions of people. And no amount of cleanup from the oil companies is going to fix that.
You never recover all the oil. Somebody who tells you that's telling you stories. Good conditions, you get half of the oil that hits the water.
So here we have a pipeline being made by corporations with a complete disregard of sovereign rights, public safety, and cultural heritage sites. On September 3rd, 2016, protesters were mortified when construction crews started bulldozing sacred Sioux burial sites. Things escalated when the protesters crossed the perimeter fence and became confrontational with the construction workers. A private security firm hired by the Dakota Access Pipeline started using pepper spray and sicking dogs on protesters.
Are you telling the dogs to bite the protesters? The dog has blood in its nose and its mouth.
This video from Democracy Now! Went viral and brought a lot of support to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Thousands of people from all across America and the world made their way to Standing Rock to join the protest movement. Even other Native American tribes. For the first time in history, all of the tribes throughout the United States came together under one issue. Then on September 8th, North Dakota Governor Dalrymple held a press conference. He then activated the National Guard to support the local law enforcement, and boy did they both show up in force, fully kitted out in riot gear and armed with mace, tear gas, concussion grenades, weapons that fire both rubber bullets and lethal rounds, even driving around in armored, mine-resistant vehicles called MRAPs. And if you think that's excessive, in early January 2017, they brought out 2 surface-to-air missile launchers. Apparently, weapons that can blow things out of the sky is appropriate for protesters armed with prayer sticks and signs. So, I was watching this whole thing drag on for months, and I was just horrified with the excessive violence the police were inflicting on the protesters. As these mass arrests were going on, stories started coming in of Native Americans being marked on their arms with numbers, you know, like in Auschwitz, and then confined to dog kennels.
Yeah, it was a large chainmail dog kennel for, over 6 hours while they didn't even actually charge us with crimes. After that, I was strip searched and then thrown into jail, and finally, late that evening, was charged with a crime.
Let me just say that I understand that this is hard to believe. None of this was caught on camera. I wouldn't necessarily have believed it myself if it wasn't for all the other shocking stuff the police have done, like abusing their power to intimidate journalists. For example, Amy Goodman, the Democracy Now! Reporter who filmed the dogs attacking protesters, was later issued an arrest warrant. This was under the charges of criminal trespassing and inciting a riot, which is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And have a look at what happened to this journalist, Erin Schroed.
We're basically on ACE property, which is the Army Corps of Engineers land, and it shouldn't even be up there. So we have every right. This is a sovereign nation right here. This is sovereign people's land.
Oh! Who the fuck is that?
You okay? You okay? Here.
Then there's also the case of police and dappled security shooting down drones used by the protesters to record on video what they've been doing. In this circumstance, their justification for this was that it posed a risk to their helicopter and was coming at them. Oh, by the way, before I forget, This is totally illegal, because legally drones are considered aircraft by the FAA, and shooting one down is a federal crime. Now, you might be asking, where was Obama in all of this? Was he going to keep the promises he made just 2 years earlier at Standing Rock about upholding treaty obligations and respecting Sioux sovereignty? Well, he was mostly busy with the elections at the time, but he was able to say this.
I think the candidates aren't really talking about is the Dakota Access Pipeline. Is that something that you would consider intervening in? People have called for your administration to make a call.
We're monitoring this closely, and I think as a general rule, my view is that there is a way for us to accommodate sacred lands of Native Americans, and I think that right now the Army Corps is examining whether there are ways to reroute this pipeline in a way. So we're going to let it play out for several more weeks and determine whether or not this can be resolved in a way that I think is properly attentive to the traditions of the first Americans.
Right, so whilst he was letting things play out, things continued to escalate in North Dakota, building up to a climactic showdown on the Backwater Bridge on Highway 1806 between the protesters and the police, when on November 20th, 2016, police used water cannons in freezing conditions, used pepper spray, tear gas, concussion grenades, and firing at protesters with rubber bullets, injuring hundreds of people in the process.
Cover yourself, guys. So just so everyone understands what's going on here, basically we've got two folks here on their knees, basically praying, and we've got cops coming over and pepper spraying for utterly no reason. Utterly no reason. That's what's going on here.
The worst wound suffered that night was by a Navajo woman called Vanessa Dundon. She had been shot in the face by a tear gas canister, and the retina in her right eye was completely severed. The standoff on the bridge continued into the next day, and the mainstream media finally began to pay attention when tragically a young woman called Sophia Wolanski nearly had her arm blown off by a concussion grenade. However, their coverage of the event was completely atrocious, as they had no journalists on site to investigate it and simply regurgitated whatever the police told them.
Authorities say they didn't use concussion grenades, rather demonstrators attacked them with makeshift explosives, even rolling 1-pound protein canisters toward officers.
What absolute bollocks! Look, we all know how trigger-happy the North Dakotan police have been. Do you think for a second that they would just use water cannons and rubber bullets if the demonstrators were attacking them with makeshift explosives? That would give them the justification to use lethal force. But CNN and every other major media outlet doesn't question it and isn't interested in the possibility that it was a concussion grenade.
Intentionally, a police officer threw a grenade that hit her right in her forearm and exploded right as it hit her forearm. There are many witnesses, and they have shrapnel.
There is no merit to that.
How do you know there's no merit to that? CNN just cut him off before he finished what he was saying. The father was just explaining that they found shrapnel in her forearm, which is an easy way to identify if it came from a concussion grenade or some homemade explosives. Hey, CNN, if you actually had some people on the ground, you could, I don't know, interview the doctors at the hospital, have the evidence analyzed in a lab, CSI Miami style, or, at the very least, have someone comb through litter on site and see if they can find any bloody concussion grenades.
This is a little bit what we picked up from the barricade. We got an instantaneous blast, one that's already been blasted, and we have a full one that they pulled the pin and they didn't even cut the tape. That's an act of terrorism right there. Get a good look at that. This is what blew up the girl's arm.
Yeah, because these edges are really sharp, and like you can tell, you could cut yourself on that.
Yeah, and this one actually went in. Some of them blow out.
Swinging out one. Let me hold this while you're swinging your hand.
So when those explode, these sharp edges pull open, and then the lid flies off. So any of that could have ripped open her arm.
Just by doing a 5-minute Google search, you could find the make of this instantaneous blast grenade. And if you look all the way at the bottom, it reads, Warning, this product is to be used only by authorized and trained law enforcement, corrections, or military personnel. This product may cause serious injury or death to you or others. So, unless the protesters have access to military-grade hardware, then I think the evidence is so far on their side. But the mainstream media can't be bothered to do some actual journalism and investigate. Hell, they can't even be bothered to watch the video they're reporting on.
Law enforcement sprayed demonstrators with powerful blasts of water. Police say demonstrators set fires.
What fires? You mean these fires? The fires they're using to warm themselves after being drenched with freezing water in -2 degrees Celsius? Well, I admit that it's kind of hard to make out of this angle. What about this one? Seems pretty clear to me what kind of fires these guys are setting. Oh, and isn't it nice that the cops are trying to put it out? You know, whilst people are suffering from hypothermia. The only other types of fires being set were from tear gas canisters and concussion grenades. So anyway, despite the mainstream media's coverage, the standoff at the bridge went viral and gathered even more support for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the biggest of which was a group called Veterans Stand for Standing Rock, in which 4,000 veterans turned up to the Jenesis camp. Their mission? To act as human shields and protect the water protectors.
And our question to the federal government is, where the fuck are you? Because we're here, and the indigenous people have been praying for months for the white father to fucking come. We want you to come now. Now's the time.
When I was watching this, I was on the edge of my seat because I knew that it put the Obama administration in a corner. Since Americans love their veterans so much, how would they react if American cops fired on American veterans? And how would American cops react to being faced by American veterans?
We have received very concerning intel that an element within the protest movement wants to exploit veterans with PTSD, arm them, and try to trigger their PTSD and turn them aggressive. Besides being horrible and wrong, it could be dangerous and deadly.
And you could be full of shit. Anyway, fortunately that confrontation never happened. On December 4th, 2016, the Obama administration and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers denied the final permit to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Instead, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would undertake an environmental impact statement and look for alternative routes. At the Jenesis camp, the Sioux and the rest of their native and non-native allies celebrated. But unfortunately, this victory would be brief. As one president left, another took office. A president with a huge conflict of interest to see the pipeline be completed. As President Trump has major investments in Energy Transfer Partners and another company called Phillips 66, which owns 1/4 share of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And if that wasn't evidence enough, Trump appointed Rick Perry as the Secretary of Energy. He is a climate change denier and a former board member for Energy Transfer Partners. And then, on January 24th, 2017, Trump signed an executive order approving the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and was quickly followed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers granting the final easement for the pipeline, skipping the environmental impact statement ordered in December. As of this recording, the oil has yet to flow, but based on the past, I'm truly worried for the future. Now, I'm guessing that some of you may be divided in the comment section as to why I've dedicated a good chunk of this simple movie review to the Dakota Access Pipeline. Well, as I see it, the history of the Sioux's plight doesn't end in 1877, nor does it end at Wounded Knee. It is unfolding as we speak. We are seeing history in the making, and it's largely being ignored. The Sioux have been fighting for their sovereign rights for over 150 years, and it's amazing to see that, to this very day, they are still warriors of the plains. Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and ever since I started this channel, I wanted to do a gangster movie. Based on the book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi, this is the true story of mafia mobster Henry Hill and his life in the Lucchese crime family. But Goodfellas is much more than just another gangster film. In my opinion, it is the best mafia movie ever made. You can't deny its impact, because after Goodfellas we got a surge of excellent mobster movies in the 90s. But it was Goodfellas that paved the way, and it's now become a huge part of our pop culture.
How am I funny?
I don't know, you say funny things.
What do you mean by that?
Why, I said you're swell, that's all.
You saying that I got a big head? Is that what you're saying? What am I, a bloated, puffy roundhead here to amuse you? I make you laugh. I'm here to fucking amuse you.
Well, your gangster rap certainly amuses me. Oh yeah, I'm deadly serious. This actually happened. Joe Pesci, the star of Goodfellas, had a rap song called Wise Guy. This is what you're watching right now. You have to see it to believe it.
Hey, paid with the stash. Treat all my bras like trash. You'll catch a blast if you move too fast. I talk class. You don't have to ask. Getting everything by flash and cash. Right?
Oh my god, it's so awful. What? Oh, come on, mate. I'm only kidding.
Sometimes you don't sound like you're kidding. You know, there's a lot of people around.
I was only kidding. You can't expect to make a shitty hip-hop music video and not be made fun of. But okay, fine. Maybe I've taken it a bit too far. I promise not to make any more jokes, okay? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. It's okay.
Okay, cool. Sorry to you guys as well for getting sidetracked. There's a lot I want to talk about in this review. So, as always, I'll be discussing the true story the film is based on and how much did it get right. So let's not waste any more time. This is Goodfellas. Henry Hill was born in 1943 and was raised in a rundown part of Brooklyn, New York, to an Irish father and Sicilian mother. Along with his 6 other siblings, he grew up in a typical blue-collar working-class family. Already from an early age, life's prospects seemed limited to Henry as he suffered from a multitude of learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, attention deficit disorder, and hyperactivity, none of which had been diagnosed at the time, which meant his difficulty with school was met with very little sympathy.
Even the fucking principal one day told me, I got a bad voice, right? And I can't carry a fucking tune. And my principal told me, shh, Henry, hum. Don't sing the national anthem. Imagine that. Imagine being told you can't sing the fucking national anthem. That so sucked. I mean, so, you think I like school? No, I did. And then when I went to school, I'd be sitting in the fucking corner looking at the wall because they thought I was a fuck-up.
Because they weren't able to understand what was going on, the teachers at the school thought he was messing about and intentionally being disruptive. This of course led Henry to resent school, convincing him that there was no future in his education, so what was the point of even trying?
It's a letter from school. Says you haven't been there in months.
In months! You think this will stop? A bomb!
When I first watched this scene, I just labeled Henry as a bad kid, but after researching him, I can totally sympathize with his contempt for school. As someone who also suffered from severe dyslexia and dyspraxia, I didn't have a fun time in school either, and I actually had support, whereas Henry didn't. So he really didn't have a chance.
And they used to get on top of me too and smack me in the back of the fucking head. You know? Learn this. Yeah, okay. I didn't know the alphabet until I was like in my 20s. Honest to God, that's the truth. And it was fucked up growing up. But these guys gave me a lot of attaboys and a lot of money. You know what I mean? For doing nothing. I didn't think I was doing any fucking thing wrong.
The guys he's talking about were members of Paul Barrier's crew, a capo in the Lucchese crime family. Across the street from his house was a cab stand which operated as one of their fronts. From his bedroom window, Henry would watch these mobsters step out of their expensive Cadillacs with their flash jewelry and tailored suits. He found their whole lifestyle to be intoxicating, and it was this small glimpse into their world that convinced him that he wanted to be one of them. He started off by getting a job at the cab stand and doing menial tasks like dropping off packages, parking their cars, but he loved the glamour of it and above all, feeling valued.
See, people like my father could never understand, but I was a part of something. I belonged. I was treated like a grown-up.
All right, look, they recount 519. It's a bad
Every
number.
day I was learning to score. $1 here, $1 there. I was living in a fantasy.
Bit by bit, his responsibilities at the cab stand became less harmless and increasingly illegal. Instead of dropping off packages, he was selling stolen cigarettes. Instead of parking cars, he was blowing them up. The lack of an education he would normally have gotten in school was now being replaced by one made on the streets. Arguably, the most important lesson he ever learned was when he got busted at the age of 16.
Congratulations. Here's your graduation present.
What for? I got pinched.
Everybody gets pinched, but you did it right. You told them nothing, and they got nothing.
I thought you'd be mad.
Man, I'm not mad. I'm proud of you. You took your first pinch like a man, and you learned the two greatest things in life.
What?
Look at me. Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut.
However, what the movie doesn't show was that right around this time, young Henry was having some strong reservations about the direction his life was taking him. After his arrest when he was 16, he started thinking of how to get out.
And I realized, when I was about 16, 17, they started asking me to do more things for them, you know what I mean? I says, fuck this. This shit ain't right. I says, I'm getting out of this fucking business.
In 1960, Henry joined the 82nd Airborne and left New York in an attempt to distance himself from his life of crime. However, whilst he was there, he fell back into his old criminal habits, such as gambling, loan sharking, and stuff like that. Eventually, he got thrown into the stockade for fighting and stealing a local sheriff's car and was discharged from the army. After a few years, he returned in 1963 to New York, and it didn't take long before he was back with the mob. And the crew Henry Hill ran with was led by a man called Jimmy Burke. Now, in the movie, his character is called Jimmy Conway, and I haven't been able to find out exactly why that is, apart from legal reasons. Considering the fact that Jimmy Burke was still alive when Goodfellas came out, I'm guessing he didn't want it screwing up any chance he had for parole. So anyway, upon his return to New York, that was when Henry reunited with Jimmy Burke and was taught the ropes on more lucrative criminal activities. The biggest moneymaker for the crew, of course, was hijacking trucks coming out of JFK Airport. $30 billion of cargo would pass through it every year, and they had such a well-planned system that at times, they would be able to hijack 2 to 3 trucks a day. Eventually got so bad that the United States government made a film warning drivers. However, it was kind of pointless because according to Henry Hill, up to 75% of the time, the drivers were in on it.
So you gotta understand, we grew up near the airport. It belonged to Paulie. And we had friends and relatives who worked all over the place, and they would tip us off about what was coming in and what was moving out. If any of the truckers or airlines gave us any trouble, Paulie had his union people scare them with a strike. It was beautiful. There was an even bigger moneymaker than numbers, and Jimmy was in charge of it all. Whenever we needed money, we'd rob the airport.
And that's exactly what they did, and for about 4 years they made a lot of money. But then an opportunity came along in 1967 that would put Henry Hill on the map in the eyes of the Mafia. The Air France robbery.
Big score coming from Air France. Like bags of money like this coming in, okay? From tourists and American servicemen who change their money, turn it to French money, send it back here. Calm down. Okay, well, it's beautiful, but it's totally untraceable. Okay.
Now, the guy talking to Jimmy and Henry is Robert Frenchy McMahon, who worked as an Air France foreman, and in the movie, he's the one who lets Henry and Tommy into the depot. In reality, he only tipped them off about the score and didn't have the keys they needed for the vault. They belonged to another guard who couldn't be bribed. But after a few weeks of watching him, one weakness of his was discovered: women. So Jimmy hatched a plan where they would get the guard blind drunk, drive him to a motel where a prostitute was waiting. As soon as he had taken off his trousers and was being distracted by the prostitute, they swiped his keys, copied them, and replaced them, leaving him none the wiser. And just like that, Henry and other mob associate Tommy DeSimone were able to wander freely into the Air France depot and walked out with nearly $500,000. As expected, with true Mafia custom, the loot was shared with the Vario crew, bringing Henry a lot of respect. With his share, Henry made his final attempt to distance himself from his mob pals.
It was another way of trying to fucking, insulate myself from those fucking lunatics that, that I was partners with and, hung with,
Hoping to go legitimate, he bought a club in Queens, New York called The Suite. After a few months, though, it quickly became just another mob hangout.
They just fucking followed me, you know. And the place thrived and became the fucking headquarters.
And then one event would take place in 1970 that sealed Henry's fate, and any possibility of leaving the Mafia would be gone. And that was the murder of Billy Batts. Now in the movie, Tommy Lee Simone kills Billy Batts over a petty argument.
Hey, Tommy, if I was gonna break your balls, I'd tell you to go home and get your shine box.
No more shines, Billy.
What?
I said no more shines. Maybe you didn't hear about it. You've been away a long time. They didn't go up there and tell you. I don't shine shoes anymore.
This is only partially true. That confrontation really did take place, but in Jimmy's bar, the Roberts Lounge, a few weeks before. The occasion was a welcome home party for Billy Batts, who just got out of prison, and Jimmy was only just able to restrain Tommy from hitting the guy. However, whilst Billy Batts was in prison, Jimmy had taken over his loan sharking rackets, and now that Billy was out, he wanted it back. And Jimmy was like, bollocks to that, I'm not giving you shit. So a few weeks later, Jimmy and Tommy worked out a plan to get Billy Batts stinking drunk in Henry's Club, The Sweet, one night. And when everyone had left, that was when Tommy and Jimmy made their move.
Get the door!
Let me shoot him in his big fucking mouth. Let's shoot him.
Now these psychos had killed a lot of people, but this one was different. And reason why was because Billy was a made man in the Gambino crime family. A made man was basically a special membership in the Mafia, and one of its privileges was that no one could harm you without permission from your family's boss. Otherwise, they would get killed themselves. And to make things worse, Billy Batts had very powerful friends, one of which was John Gotti, the future boss of the Gambinos. So Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy dumped Billy into the boot of their car and drove out to Connecticut to bury the body. But out on the road, however, they started hearing sounds from the boot of the car.
Jimmy. What's up? Did I hit something? What is that? Is it flat?
What? No. In one moment, they all knew Billy Batts was still alive.
It was sickening. It was fucking sickening. It was actually sickening. You know? He ended up in the fucking truck. And, you know, he looked at me. He says, "Henry, you know." And he just backed the fuck up. You know. They didn't actually shoot him. They just fucking turned and just stabbed him 30 or 40 fucking times.
Now that Henry was a witness and an accessory to the murder of Billy Batts, there was never any chance of him being able to leave the life now, not without being killed himself. So, he fully committed himself to the mob and did whatever Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke told him. In 1972, Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill were arrested for beating up Johnny Ciaccio, a gambler in Tampa, Florida, for not paying a large debt. And it turned out that the guy's sister worked for the FBI and informed her co-workers what had happened. After a lengthy investigation, pretty much everyone in the Vario crew, including Paul Vario, was sent to prison. Henry received 10 years in a federal penitentiary for interstate gambling and assault. But what's really shocking to me, and I'm sure to Henry Hill as well at the time, is that being a mobster in prison was not that bad.
When you think of prison, you get pictures in your mind of all those old movies with rows and rows of guys behind bars. But it wasn't like that for Wise Guys. I mean, everybody else in the joint was doing real time, all mixed together, living like pigs. But we lived alone. I mean, we owned the joint.
I'm gonna be honest with you, I was convinced that during my research this was gonna be one part of the movie that was heavily exaggerated for dramatic effect. But amazingly, only slightly. This pretty much sums up exactly how crooked the penal system was back then.
We give the impression of it being breezier than it was. To add to the irony of it, with the music that's playing and that sort of thing and getting lobsters. But this was what we had guards who told us this is the reality too. I mean, it was all there. It's all there. I mean, there's certain people who were privileged.
And in order to have those privileges, they had to pay $2,000 to $3,000 to the guards every month. So, without being able to earn on the outside, Henry had to find new ways to earn on the inside. And that was when he started dealing drugs. Fellow prisoners would tell Henry that the amount of money he made from hijacking trucks was minuscule compared to what they had made from selling cocaine, heroin, etc. on the streets. Prison for Henry was more of a place to network with other criminals outside of his mafia circle, and he pretty much received a college education by the end of it. When he finally got out in 1978 after serving 5 years of his 10-year sentence, he immediately began using the connections he had made in prison and started dealing narcotics. However, all of this was done in secret since it was forbidden to sell drugs in the mafia. The penalty for doing so was death, so no word of this could reach Paul Vario, but he was able to bring Tommy and Jimmy in on it, and they made a lot of money. Later that same year, a score came along that would forever immortalize Jimmy Burke's crew and make the Air France robbery look like nothing in comparison.
And these are the guys that Jimmy put together for what turned out to be the biggest heist in American history, the Lufthansa heist.
On December the 11th, 1978, acting on a tip-off from Henry and his friend Martin Krugman, Jimmy's crew broke into the Lufthansa cargo terminal and at gunpoint robbed the entire vault, walking away with nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry.
5 heavily armed, masked men today fled with an estimated $3 million in cash and $300,000 in jewelry from the Lufthansa Airlines cargo hangar at New York's Kennedy Airport.
The FBI says $2 million. Port Authority police say $4 million. The city cops say 5. Lufthansa has not said anything, but they promise to break their silence soon with a press conference. No, son of a bitch! Will be there to cover it live.
However, what should have been a time for celebration, especially since they had pulled off the score of a lifetime, it didn't take long before things started descending into chaos. The truth is, these guys had no clue they were going to walk away with that amount of money. They figured that there would only be like $1 million waiting for them in the vault. By stealing $6 million, the eyes of the world were upon them, since every crook and cop in the city immediately knew that the Vario crew were responsible. And it didn't help when a few of these idiots started buying Cadillacs and mink fur coats, much to the clear disapproval of Jimmy Burke.
Name it, son. Are you stupid or what? Did you hear what I said? Don't buy anything, don't get anything, nothing big. Did you hear what I said? What's the matter with you?
And it didn't stop there. One of the robbers, Stax Edwards, was supposed to dispose of the getaway van, but instead this genius decided to drive to his girlfriend's house, get high, and fell asleep, and the next morning, the police had found the van with his fingerprints all over it. With Stax jeopardizing the entire crew, it could only end one way for him. This was the beginning of the Lufthansa murders. Jimmy Burke became increasingly paranoid with all the public attention that other members in his crew could possibly link him to the robbery. But another factor came in play: pure greed. When Jimmy's crew learned of the true amounts they had stolen, they started demanding a larger share.
Fuck him! I want my money. Henry, I want my fucking money. I had it up to here. That cheap cigarette hijacker thing. No, fuck him.
And so Jimmy Burke, with Paul Vario's blessing, started systematically killing everyone involved in the robbery. For months, the police were finding bodies all over the place, and in total, up to 10 or so people were killed. Now you might ask yourself, why wasn't Henry killed too? Well, Henry was smart enough not to demand his share when he started seeing his mates being killed off, but Jimmy was also making a lot of money through the drugs Henry was selling. So, for the moment, he was still useful to Jimmy. But one murder would take place that Jimmy was not responsible for and would never have signed off on. Well, at least according to Henry. A week after Christmas, Jimmy and Henry were in Florida sorting out some drug deal, and Tommy remained in New York because he was going to be made. Jimmy was particularly excited because Tommy was a close friend of his. At a diner, they were waiting for the call of Tommy's initiation, when Jimmy learned they had been killed by the Gambinos for the murder of Billy Batts and another mobster called Ronald Foxy Giroux. It's been speculated that it was John Gotti himself who killed Tommy. Now there's just a couple of things I'd like to elaborate on with this murder that the film doesn't cover.
They even shot Tommy in the face, so his mother couldn't give him an open coffin at the funeral.
That's technically not true. His mother couldn't give him an open coffin simply because there was nothing in the coffin. Tommy DeSimone just disappeared and his body has never been found. There also might have been another reason why Tommy was murdered, but it's a little complicated, so I'll try to keep it simple. According to Henry Hill, Paul Vario was having an affair with his wife Karen, and when Henry was in prison, Tommy DeSimone tried to rape Karen when she turned him down for sex. When Karen told Paulie what had happened, he apparently approached the Gambinos and told them about Billy Batts, about Foxy, everything that Tommy ever did. So that reason, along with possibly wanting to remove yet another link to the Lufthansa heist, may be why Tommy was killed. But these are just theories because his murder still remains unsolved today. So by 1980, Henry was heavily addicted to the drugs he was selling. Every day he was snorting cocaine, heroin, and popping fistfuls of Quaaludes. I mean, it was getting ridiculous. I'm actually very impressed he was able to stand, let alone function.
Stop with those fucking drugs. They're making your wine into mush. You hear me?
Not only that, but this was right around the time when the FBI was really starting to clamp down on the mafia with their heavy surveillance and their high-profile arrests. With this kind of heat, it was only a matter of time before Henry got nicked. Now, what's really funny is when the police arrested Henry, they weren't able to find any drugs on him. I think they just found like a single Quaalude in his pocket or something. That was until they got to his girlfriend who'd been preparing Henry's drugs at her house and had never bothered cleaning up the place. The cops found drugs on cooking utensils, on the walls, on the carpet. I'm sure just by hoovering the place, they had a whole sack full of evidence to use against Henry.
Bye-bye, dickhead.
Henry was now screwed in more ways. Not only was he facing 25 years to life, but he also had to worry about Paul Vario because he had broken the mafia's strict law against selling drugs, and he had now become a liability to Jimmy Burke because he was the last survivor of the Lufthansa heist.
I knew Paulie was going to whack me, Jimmy was going to whack me, you know. It was so fucking crazy.
With no way out, Henry became the very thing he had always hated, a rat. He cooperated with the FBI for full immunity and told them everything about the Lufthansa heist, all the scams, the rackets, the murders, the robberies, the hijackings, everything he had ever witnessed in his life with the mob. His testimonies put away 50 mobsters behind bars, including Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. The evidence presented by Henry really shook the criminal underworld and showed the public just how much of a grip the Cosa Nostra had on American society.
We ran everything. We paid off cops, we paid off lawyers, we paid off judges. Everybody had their hands out. Everything was for the taking. And now it's all over.
And it really was for Henry. He and his family went into witness protection and were moved to Omaha, Nebraska under new identities. It was a second chance for Henry to start over again, but he was never able to truly move on from his criminal past. He became heavily addicted to drugs and especially alcohol, and in 1987, he was arrested on drug trafficking charges in Seattle. Eventually, due to his repeated criminal offenses, he was kicked out of the witness protection program. And pretty much ever since then, the only way he can make any real money is by constantly reliving his life in the mafia. So it's not surprising to me why Henry Hill became such an alcoholic when he was always being reminded of the horrible things he did during his interviews for books, movies, radio shows, and documentaries.
Some guys leave the life and go quietly about their business. Others leave the life and make it a career that they've left the life. They're out of the life, but they still want to cash in on the life, and they're making it a payday.
It was a culture shock, to say the least, with a book deal and a movie deal. You know, I mean, I thought I was going to be left alone and open up a little mom and pop restaurant, because I'd always owned restaurants or nightclubs. You know, just fade away into the, into the land of happy destiny. It didn't turn out that way.
When I said earlier that Goodfellas is the best mafia movie ever made, I really meant it, and I think by the end of this video you'll understand exactly why I believe it is. But when I decided to review it, I did not want to make the same points everyone else has made. I mean, it's like some people have forgotten about what made this film great in the first place, and they can only identify iconic performances and great camera work.
You gotta admit that the Steadicam shot in Goodfellas was the money.
And then there are some people who don't even do that. They just worship Goodfellas based on his cult status.
What's up, movie monsters? As we make our way through the legendary IMDb Top 250, we've already seen some pretty great movies so far, but now we're up for something good.
It's in the name.
Made by legendary Wolf of Wall Street director Sir Martin Scorsese.
He scores!
Let's break down all the reasons this movie rocks. Number 1 came out in 1990. Die Hard 2. Back to the Future Part 3. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Goodfellas.
Talk about era of the instant classic.
Great Scott. I know, this is heavy. Don't believe the hype? Check out who else agrees with me. The Academy of Arts and Sciences. Hollywood Foreign Press Association. British Academy of Film and Television Nickelodeon Arts. Kids' Choice. American Cinema Editors.
Does this guy look familiar?
Believe it or not, this is actually the same dude from Home Alone. Can't unsee it. Hashtag.
Oh my god, I hate YouTube sometimes. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that if we look past the gloss, past the camera work, and past the performances, you will still find plenty of really cool stuff to talk about. Like, for example, how groundbreaking and authentic Goodfellas is with its portrayal of the Mafia and actual history. In fact, by exploring this, I think you can appreciate Goodfellas even more, because what this film does very well is that it counters the romantic image of the mob, an image that began in the 1930s with gangster classics such as The Public Enemy, Little Caesar, and of course, the original Scarface. These films were based on the crimes of the day and real-life mobsters who were glamorized by the public, and since these gangster films were almost an urban extension of the Western, the same myth-like status old outlaws had, such as Billy the Kid and Jesse James, were now applied to mobsters like Lucky Luciano and Al Capone. So the romanticized depiction of the Mafia would continue, even with one of the greatest films in American cinema, The Godfather. Now, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate from this from the comments section, but The Godfather is not a great example of authenticity. I mean, first and foremost, it's based on a book by Mario Puzo, and what's presented on the screen is very operatic. I mean, it's larger than life, and idolizes admirable qualities such as honor and respect that the Mafia were not really interested in. And also another thing to consider is that when The Godfather was made, the Mafia were at the height of their power, and they even used it to influence this movie directly.
Around that time, the producer of The Godfather came to visit Joe Colombo. He sent for him. And Joey actually looked at the script of The Godfather back then. And he took any reference to the word mafia, he pulled it out of the script.
Getting the Justice Department of the United States to ban the use of the word mafia. That's pretty good political power.
Kind of makes you wonder what else might have been changed or omitted from the script. But anyway, that's just my opinion with The Godfather. It's a brilliant work of art, but it's pure fantasy as far as I'm concerned. Whereas Goodfellas definitely comes the closest in just showing us how psychotic these bastards really were. I mean, their power was not based off honor and respect, but fear and intimidation, which they used brutally and effectively. And since everyone was terrified of these lunatics, they had free reign to do whatever they wanted. Like, for example, this scene.